Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I'm sure that approximately 100% of you are waiting for Imam Zaid to come up, so I'll try to stay within my time. And but I also want to thank the organizers. I want to thank Shakir for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to be in this beautiful building, which I understand was just really recently expanded, and it's beautiful, mashallah. So mabruk, and it's an honor for me to be here to be talking with you for a short time. So the title of the talk of the event is The Art of Disagreement. Now, disagreement and agreement from a certain point of view are really two sides of one coin. And it seems as though we're not on that side of the coin in the contemporary discourse. We're really on the other side of the coin, which is a kind of a chaos, which is endemic to the public sphere and public discourse and so forth. And I want to be able to understand why this is the case by not just talking today about things like the ethics of disagreement. There's a very developed tradition within Islam of dealing with these matters. You have topics like, for example, adab al-bahath, the idea of how to have a proper disagreement with somebody. That's a very well-developed discourse in Islamic civilization. How to the proper adab to have with people when you disagree with them, or when you talk to them. These are all very important topics, but it's not what I'm going to focus on in my remarks tonight. What I'd like to do is to expand our scope of vision to be able to look at things in a slightly deeper way. My main thrust tonight is that disagreement and agreement, the art of disagreement, comes from, I thought that was me. The art of disagreement really comes from the art of thinking. And the problem with us today is not so much that we have discord at the social and cultural level, which we do, but that we have fragmentation and failure at the level of ultimate questions. That is to say, not just political or social, cultural questions, but at the level of ultimate questions. And I'll say more about what I mean by ultimate questions. And so when we don't think clearly, we even fail to disagree. Right, so we usually think about the failure to agree, but really what we do in the present context, we fail even to disagree. To disagree means to have a coherent idea about where you are and where your interlocutor is coming from, and we know that this really happens very rarely. So we don't have harmony or discord, but as I said, we have chaos. Chaos. Because the usual problems are familiar. We have the problem of demonization of the other. We have the inability or unwillingness to listen to people. We have groupthink, kind of herd mentality, and also just when you're in the public sphere or when you're online or when you're talking to somebody, you have the vices, the traditional vices. You have arrogance, you have timidity, you have various kinds of passions which enter into debate and when people talk to each other. Now, these are all real problems, and we all face them all the time. And they have immediate causes, and we can point to them as immediate causes, but they also have deeper causes. They also have ultimate causes. So, for example, if you hurt your back lifting a couch, the immediate cause is that you lifted the couch, but the deeper cause, you might say, the conditions for that is that you don't exercise enough, so your muscles aren't strong, and also nobody taught you how to lift a couch the proper way. And so there's an immediate cause, but there's also a deeper cause for why those kind of problems happen. So how does that relate to the topic at hand? And we have a media culture. We have a social media culture, which is almost not even a culture. We have political culture, educational culture, different kinds of culture, different levels of culture. But we also have what I would call a culture of ultimate questions. A culture of ultimate questions. What do I mean by that phrase? Every civilization, whether it's a religious civilization or whether it's modern civilization, has this culture of ultimate questions, which is the institutions, the people, the ideas, the literature, the kind of streams within the civilization that are responsible for exploring, for posing questions, for exploring ultimate questions like, what is reality? What is the nature of knowledge? What is the nature of the good? What does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to live a life with purpose? Where are we going in the universe? What is the nature of God? And by ultimate questions, in other words, those questions which are at the boundary of all possible explorations. And every culture, whether it has a properly functioning culture of ultimate questions or a badly functioning one, has one, right? Islamic civilization traditionally before it's, I mean, now it's fallen on rather bad times, but Islamic civilization in its heyday had this culture of ultimate questions, and essentially the people who were responsible for running it were the theologians, the mutakallimun, the philosophers, or the falasifa, or the hukama, and the Sufis, or tasawwuf, or sometimes translated as the mystics. Which is to say that in these various fields of endeavor, you had people whose job it was to talk about these things, to explore them, to provide answers for people, and so forth. And when you have a healthy, functioning culture of ultimate questions, you have, I would argue, this is one of my main claims, you have a healthy society, and that it's very difficult to have a healthy culture and a healthy civilization without a properly functioning element to the civilization which deals with these kinds of questions because they have a knock-on effect. So what about modern society? What about modern civilization, right? There's not a lot of Sufis and Sufi theologians and metaphysicians of the old sort around anymore. What is the modern culture of ultimate questions, which is, by the way, the global culture of ultimate questions? It's not as though there's multiple such cultures anymore. We all live in a global society. We as Muslims can't detach ourselves and say, well, here's modernity and here is us. We're all sunk in the same and embedded in the same culture. And so, what is it? Basically, it's three areas, or which correspond to three sort of institutional areas. Science, you might say science with a capital S. Philosophy, right, with a capital P. And then art, which sometimes goes under the name culture, right? So between science, the scientists, scientific ideas and so forth, philosophy, philosophers and so forth, art, artists, novelists, and that includes things like literature and film and so forth. These are you might say, the territories or the domains in our culture, in our society, where people go to get their answers to their most basic, deepest questions, right? Beyond these areas, there's not really places where such questions are asked. And these three domains of modern life correspond roughly, and here it's going to get a little bit abstract, but I'm going to try and bring it to some more specific examples. Science, philosophy, and art correspond roughly here to the basic three ways or the three modes of thinking, the three dimensions of thought that people have when they think about ultimate questions. Number one, you have people's notion of what reality is. What is? What is the nature of reality? Secondly, you have the dimension of thinking which is what is possible or what can be. What is possible, impossible, necessary, probable. And finally, what ought to be. That is to say, what's good and bad, what's beautiful and ugly, and so forth. These are sort of the three very general domains that science, philosophy, and art and culture, generally speaking, that is to say, what is reality, how things work, and how it should all fit together. Let me give you an example so it's not too abstract, very concrete. If I make a statement that says, the sun is below the horizon and will rise tomorrow at 6:32 a.m., that seems like a very plain statement to make. Now, how is it that you can see embedded in this these three dimensions of thought? Well, first of all, if you make the statement, the sun is below the horizon and will rise tomorrow at 6:32 a.m., you first of all believe in some vision of what reality is. There's a thing called the sun, and there it is. I believe that it's there. Secondly, you have this notion that celestial objects like the sun and the earth, they behave in a certain way. That there's a certain way in which, for example, if the sun is below the horizon, it's impossible for it to be above the horizon. The fact that you don't see it above means that it's definitely below. This is, in a sense, a judgment that's made. It's not a grasp of reality as it is, but it's a grasp of reality based upon what you know to be possible, impossible, probable, and so forth. And then finally, the question of what ought to be, or judging what's good and bad, is the fact that in order to be able to make a statement like that, it requires a tremendous amount of trust in institutions, believing in the credibility of scientists, and so forth and so on. So even to make it, for example, how do we know that it's going to rise tomorrow at 6:32 a.m.? I mean, it requires a tremendous amount of reliance upon other people, judging, well, is this person a liar or a truth teller? Is this institution reliable or not? And so forth and so on. There's a lot of different examples that one can use, but I just wanted to establish it as a topic. So, and my main sort of argument here, you might say the main thing to keep in mind, is that these three aspects of thinking, thinking about what is, thinking about what's possible, thinking about what ought to be and what's good and bad, they go together like 3 dimensions of space. Right? So for example, imagine you're flying a plane. You have to know the altitude, you have to know the latitude, and you have to know the longitude, or else you don't know where you are. Right? So when it comes to thinking, it's the same thing. You have to know what you think reality is, you have to know what you think is possible, and you also have to know what you think is good and bad in order for you to really understand, to use that metaphor, where you're coming from or where someone else is coming from. And so if I can just again be a little bit abstract, for maybe there's a few people, there's a few kind of nerdy types online, you might say that what I'm saying is every factual claim is embedded in a theoretical claim and dependent upon a moral claim. Every theoretical claim is about a factual claim and guided by a moral claim. Every moral claim presupposes a factual claim and is chosen by a theoretical claim. Now, that's extremely kind of abstract, and maybe you didn't catch any of that. So I want to make it more concrete. What do I mean by that? These domains of science and philosophy and art in the modern context, in modern civilization, essentially, in the picture I'm painting, is that they share a kind of a division of labor to deal with ultimate questions, right? So it's when it comes to values and what we think is beautiful or good, we don't really ask scientists. We ask artists, we ask novelists, we ask people who are writing literature, and there's a kind of a different division of labor. But the problem in modern society is that this division of labor is not harmonious. It doesn't work together well. It's very discordant. Right? These domains of science, of philosophy, and art, they don't play well together, you might say. And they're always trying to define themselves against each other, and each one is always trying to say, no, we're not the other two. The problem with that is that when any of these domains, whether it's science or philosophy or art, or whether it's a focus on what reality is, or it's a focus on, let's say, logic and reason and imagination, or a focus on values and beauty and aesthetics and ethics. Without being aware of the other 2 domains, you can't properly carry out the one. All 3 of them have to be there for any one of them to function properly. So for example, I'll give you now some very concrete examples of how this works, how it is that this kind of fracturing and fragmentation in the modern culture of ultimate questions leads to problems that then affect the question at hand, which is the problem of disagreement. So problem number one that arises from this fragmentation between these various domains. Number one, and you've seen this and you've run across it, you have the invocation of evidence without making clear your interpretive assumptions and your framework, and without acknowledging one's authority structure. That is to say, you make a claim about saying, well, this is obvious, this is obviously true, this is what reality is, but you don't tell people that, well, by this, I'm assuming that reality works in such and such a way, and this is what I expect to happen, and moreover, these are the individuals that I trust to tell me what's true, right? And we cannot function without that. The best example of this in the contemporary context are the new atheists, who are really just the most aggressive subset of something that's called scientism. That is to say, believe anything that scientists say in the name of science, right? It's just, well, it's obvious what's true, right? But it's not obvious what's true, right? Because the study of nature, for example, depends a lot upon what questions we ask of nature. You could say, well, the experiment told us that such and such is true, but then, well, what told you which experiment to run? You see, these are important questions that arise. So number one, the first problem is the invocation of evidence without acknowledging the theoretical framework and the moral framework. The second problem are methods of analysis. That is to say, what is a method of analysis in this context? That is to say, it's a way of figuring out how to interpret and understand the world. For example, Marxism is a method of analysis. It tells you what's possible or necessary or can't happen or has to happen. Evolutionary psychology is a method of analysis about human nature. And you have different thinkers whose names you don't know, but who are tremendously influential in the academy and in literature and the humanities, people like Foucault and Nietzsche, Derrida, and so forth and others. And basically the second problem is when you have a method of analysis that forgets what it's about and also what the moral picture of the world is that guides that analysis. And I'll give you a very specific example of this. When you go to study at the university, you're often presented with these ideas that will tell you, for example, that human beings act not because they're independent and they have a will and they're rational, but because they're determined by this or that outside factor. It's gender that makes them do what they do. It's race that makes them do what they do. It's language that makes them do what they do, some other aspect of culture, class. All of these things basically are the way in which we can sort of say, well, look at what human beings are doing. We can explain what human beings are doing completely and utterly by these outside factors, which has the logical problem that if you're explaining all human behavior, let's say in terms of power, that it's just all desire for power, well, then that theory itself is all about a desire for power too, and it invalidates itself. So that's a second kind of problem. The third kind of problem number 3, is you have moral or normative demands that are unconnected with the set of choices that out of which they're deemed best, and secondly, an account of human nature that renders such impossibilities intelligible. I'll give you a concrete example of what I mean by this. We're told, for example, that art is subjective, right? That values are just values are a thing that you can have. You know, you can't argue about, you can't talk about them. You just have them. Like you have a value and I have a value, and these are not things that can be discussed. Is that the issue? I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. So you have moral or normative demands that are made without kind of acknowledging one's theoretical approach or by taking into account what reality is. So another example, again, out of philosophy, you have this kind of disavowal of moral thinking. Really, this is a real kind of problem in the academy, this disavowal of moral thinking, which is nonetheless carried out by people who have a kind of a moral program, right? So people who have, to use the political parlance, they have an agenda, you might say. But then they claim to not have an agenda because they're sort of above the idea of right and wrong. That's very kind of naive, they say. But nevertheless, it hides a kind of a moral agenda. Now again, that's all somewhat theoretical and kind of abstract, and you might think, what does that have to do with disagreement? What does it have to do with the art of disagreement? What does it have to do with what happens in the comment section on the internet? You know, what does it have to do with what happens in the mosque? And I think these three problems have a very deep effect. Because number one, the first problem, this idea of invoking evidence without thinking that you have to talk about your theoretical framework, produces people, not just people on social media, but people in the academy, scientists, people who we look to for their ideas, people who think that what they believe is obvious and it doesn't need an argument. It's just obvious. It doesn't really need an argument. I mean, think of a figure like Richard Dawkins or his, kind of evil henchman Sam Harris. I mean, there's not really an argument there. It's kind of, it's clear what you should believe, and if you don't, there's just something wrong with you. Either morally speaking, you're stupid. Because it's so obvious. The second problem produces people who believe that if you believe that other people's beliefs are always determined by race or by power or by gender or by some outside factor or by the very structure of their language, you're going to not really feel the need to pay attention to their arguments or to pay attention to what they have to say. But you're just going to be saying, well, I don't need to listen to what you say because I know what group you belong to. I know where you come from, and that explains everything that you have to say. There's no reason to pay attention to you. The third problem is that you produce people, that is to say, the disconnection of moral commitments from discourse, from the theoretical and factual framework. It produces people whose goals and their agenda is essentially hidden. It's kind of hidden from view. They pretend that there's no reason to talk about right and wrong or good and bad. It's kind of passé. But nevertheless, they have that aspect of things. And so it's hidden from other people, but actually sometimes it's hidden from themselves, and they have a very poorly articulated vision of what's right and wrong. And the problem with having a non-articulated vision of what's right and wrong, and the problem with thinking that you don't need to talk about what's right and wrong philosophically or to articulate it, is that your views cannot be critiqued. You have a position and there's no arguing about it. And so what does this produce? You have not just the comment section on the internet, but you have the university. You have scientists, philosophers, artists, and you have these rampant problems of people who think that what they think is just obvious. You have a problem that you don't need to listen to other people because what they think is really determined ultimately by these outside factors extrinsic to them. And thirdly, you have people who don't know how to articulate their moral views or don't think they need to, and for that reason fall into a kind of a sloppy thinking, or in some cases a kind of a tyrannical mode of thinking, where they just sort of assume that they have to force their views on other people because they can't think rationally about it. These three problems have a very anti-rational character. They're really toxic, they're poison thought. They make it incapable of thinking. This has a knock-on effect. That is to say, if you go to school, if you go to college, and not every single last one, but if most of your professors, or a good number of your professors in the sciences, in the humanities, and so forth and so on, are suffering from these intellectual problems, right, at a deep level, if the books that you're reading have these problems in them, then of course it's going to have an effect, because when you go, your favorite author that you read might not sound like he's a philosopher, but he's read philosophers. He's affected by it. Your favorite political activist is affected by these ideas, right? Your favorite, let's say, scientist or engineer or so forth, when they study in school, these ideas seep into them. And I think there's a very strong connection between this deep level, you might say the sickness and the fragmentation at the level of ultimate questions, and it makes its way into the broader society, sometimes invisibly, most often invisibly. Now, you might be wondering why, up until this point, I haven't said anything about religion. Because, well, isn't religion part of the culture of ultimate questions, right? What's more ultimate than religion? The problem is that modern culture defines itself against religion. Each of these domains, science defines itself against religion. Philosophy defines itself against religion. Art defines itself against religion. And we have to sort of also keep that in mind. And actually, I would argue that modernity's fragmentation, I can't argue this, but I want to leave you with this thought, is that modernity's fragmentation, these kind of fragmentation of these ideas, historically, I think if you study it, is a direct result of the fact that modernity represents a kind of a rebellion against religion. So what can you do about this? I mean, this is all a kind of a diagnosis, what can be done about this? Well, I think at a minimum, intelligent people, when you're reading the New Yorker or you're listening to a political speech or what have you, when you're interacting at this level of disagreement, you can have a kind of an approach of a kind of an intellectual self-defense, Just the way a pilot, as I mentioned before, a pilot has to keep track of the altitude and the longitude and the latitude. When you encounter ideas, you can have a way of situating yourself by trying to, let's say, look at all three of these angles. So, for example, you might ask yourself, am I disagreeing with somebody's factual claim? Is this a problem at the level of fact? Or is this a problem of a mode of analysis? Is the way in which they're analyzing the world and assuming how things work different from mine? Or are their moral commitments different from mine? Or a combination of the three? And I think we have to be able to, even when we don't fully understand it, and we can't all become philosophers or scientists or understand the deep motivations of art, but we at least have to be aware that there's a connection at that level. And that if we're awake to it, you can then begin to, you might say, compensate for it. Maybe you can't change other people, but it can at least help you to become a little bit more, you might say, sane and also grounded when you're encountering disagreements of various kinds. Alhamdulillah. Thank you very much.